We talked briefly about the lockdown, and we know, hopefully, why we have never used lockdowns before in the West to control pandemics. They're devastating, and we're living the outcome of that. Go to some of my other favorite mitigation schemes. Masking. Talk a little bit about, everybody knows my feelings about masks to control respiratory viruses. From an epidemiologic standpoint, did you ever see evidence that masks would be helpful in controlling this pandemic?
And if I could follow on that a little bit, I've been very curious about the studies that were used to substantiate masking, particularly of
Hmm.
school children. Those studies seem completely spurious to me, and yet knowledgeable people push those out
Hmm.
as evidence of what they should be doing. Can you also address that if you don't mind? I appreciate it.
I'll try. So, really more fundamental than all of that is that we spent 2 or 2.5 years being bombarded with plausibility and being told it was science. And this is a philosophical issue that is a very serious one because people think what they've heard over the last 2.5 years is science. Dr. Fauci says, I am the science. And he's said nothing scientific for the last 2.5 years. What he said is plausibility. So the idea that if you put this cloth or paper or whatever material mask in front of your nose and mouth, and that's going to prevent the virus from going through it or around it, is a plausibility argument. It looks like you put something in front of you and it blocks what goes through. But in reality, what you're talking about is putting up a chain link fence and hoping that it blocks mosquitoes. That the 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 You have to understand that the only way that these theories can be made into science is by studying them in people. Now, I love theories. I
Yeah.
use biological theories in all of my research all along. I've made up some myself and studied them and tested them in studies of case controls of humans. The only way that you know whether a theory is true or not is by extensive testing it in humans. And the lab scientists kind of pass on that step and they believe in their lab studies and they don't think epidemiology is worth anything, whereas we epidemiologists know the limitations of epidemiology. We do high quality studies as best we can, and we then validate or invalidate the theories or provide evidence, pro and con at least, on theories. That's where the science is. When you go into the lab and you do measurements on a theory, that's where the science is. The theory is the motivation for the science, but it's not the science. The testing, the
Right.
experiments, and the population studies are the science. And so what we've seen of these studies looking at masking, masking has two potential benefits. One is for the wearer. Does wearing a mask reduce the likelihood that the wearer is going to get sick or very sick or so on? The second is what's called source control, which is, does masking people keep an infection from spreading to other people? Those are two very different things. If you're wearing a mask for your own benefit, then it's up to you to choose whether you want to wear the mask or not. You're the one who has control of your own treatments. There has no bearing on anybody else. Whereas if wearing a mask limits the amount of infection spread, then the state, the company, the school, whatever, has some sway, some interest in deciding whether people should wear masks or not. There are only, to my knowledge, about 3 studies that have looked at source control in the COVID era for masking. And all of them show either zero or very negligible amount of benefit in reducing the spread of infection from mask wearing. So the evidence is quite weak for source control benefit. It's possible. My own kind of ad hoc idea about this is if you're wearing a mask and you're infectious and you meet somebody on the stairs in the hall and you have a 15-second conversation with them, the probability is that the mask has some benefit because it pushes what you exhale out the sides rather than directly in front. And if you're only there for 15 seconds, that hasn't mixed in the surrounding air and gotten to the person in front of you, whereas it would have if you were breathing straight at them. But if you're in a room for 5, 10, 20, 30 minutes and the air is all mixing, it doesn't matter whether it goes out straight or goes out sideways because it's still going to mix in the air and everybody else in the room is going to get it unless there's enough air changes per hour that the mixed air would still be exited before most people breathed it. So, to that degree, masks might have a very small and transient benefit in source control, but in the general usage that we've come to think about for longer term exposures, they probably have very little, if maybe zero.
Yet, yes,
Yeah.
and yet there's still UC Berkeley, Drew. UC Berkeley is requiring students to wear masks
I
this
know.
this fall if they
I
haven't
know.
been vaccinated for the flu. I mean, it's just you can't make this up.
Yeah.
We have taken
Yeah. And
it's
so
beyond
where
the
are they
pale.
getting that from? I'm really trying to maintain my equanimity on all this stuff and try to understand people's point of view who push these sorts of ideas. I swim in it when I try to figure it out. I can't figure it out. I want to figure it out so I can understand what we're dealing with, but where do they get these ideas from?
Well, I have an idea of where this comes from, but that idea perhaps stalled on August 11th. The idea was that university policies are being driven by their corporate attorneys, by the attorneys who are basically human, they're personnel attorneys that deal with hiring and firing and all those kinds of questions. And these attorneys were telling the institutions that if anything bad happens, you need policies that show that you were actually doing something that was publicly looked at as being beneficial to prevent the things that actually did happen. So, what this means is that the universities were developing policies that were driven by the so called suggestions of CDC, WHO, and other formal public health agencies that had some sense of public authority. And so when a university, if somebody got myocarditis from taking the vaccine, the day after that they had their second dose that the university mandated, the university would say, well, we mandated vaccination because the CDC said that people should be vaccinated, and we're just following their guidance. So this is the just following orders defense that they were instructed to do. Now, the strange thing about that is that on August 11th, CDC put out a public statement saying that from their evidence, the vaccines do not prevent, well, I should say, 2 doses of the vaccines do not prevent transmission of the infection. And booster doses provide only transient benefit that wanes over time. And what they're saying basically is that the vaccines have failed to prevent transmission in the population of this virus. That removes the vaccine mandates rationale that's coming from the CDC. Nevertheless, some universities like Harvard have continued to maintain vaccine mandates, and in fact, Harvard just started including the half new booster vaccine as part of its mandate for all students, incoming and continuing students, which makes no sense and has no justification because the CDC is saying that it doesn't prevent transmission in any tangible way. So
So
it's
much
hard
of
for me to
my
know.
Yeah, so much of the thought bubble over my head is sort of, this big question mark all the time. And so as it pertains to this policy that I appreciate that point of view because that makes sense to me. It's like, okay, that's probably what's going on. What I don't understand though is why don't academic colleagues who know better raise their hand and go, but this is not science, at least be honest about what you're doing here and don't give the impression that this is somehow good policy. I don't hear anyone from the medical or the scientific community at these institutions, and maybe they are, I just don't hear it. Is that true or should they be?
There was a letter at I think it was Columbia, where an assistant professor raised a question about the vaccines and provided all of this evidence, pages of the current evidence, including the CDC's statement now, and it was signed by at least 80 faculty members in the medical school and the arts and sciences school, I think.
Okay.
So important.
Well, the concept, though,
Okay,
the concept
there it
that
is.
once the CDC and I've made this argument many times, once the CDC now openly acknowledges, just as the vaccine manufacturers do, that the vaccines do not stop you from contracting COVID, they do not stop you from transmitting COVID, and the best, although it's on very shaky data, they say that it will decrease the severity of your illness. Well, that's up to me if I wanted to decrease the severity. Again, that's similar to the wearer of the mask. It's my personal choice. If I don't care, if I think that I will handle the virus just fine on my own, then how can they justify mandating a vaccine to decrease my risk of getting hospitalized? That's my choice. And I think that that's an argument that you've been making compellingly. I'm not sure how they're getting around that.
Well, that was actually the Jacobson case from 1905, the Supreme Court case, where Cambridge, Massachusetts had a smallpox vaccination law,
Right.
and this man Jacobson said, "I don't want to do it. I want to pay the fine. Willing to pay the fine," and then he went to court over it, and the Supreme Court found that he was guilty and had to pay the fine. And in doing so, it created 4 criteria for reviewing the interest of the state in forcing mandates for vaccination on people. These criteria are very close to what in the legal realm is called strict scrutiny. And among them, it's that the vaccination has to be known to work, medically speaking. It has to be narrowly tailored, which means it only applies as closely and as necessitatively, some word like that, as possible. And it can't be arbitrary and capricious. And that might have been the case for the smallpox vaccine at a time when smallpox had about a 30% mortality in the early 1900s. It certainly does not apply in the COVID era, and it certainly does not apply in the Omicron era when the mortality is less than 0.2%, and it's virtually all among high-risk people. And and we've lost on arbitrary and capricious because it doesn't take into account natural immunity from having had COVID in the first place, and so on. So it's not narrowly tailored. People who've had natural infection with COVID don't need vaccination in order to be protected from transmitting it to others, and yet all of the vaccines ignore natural immunity. So what we have now is the criteria for establishing when a mandate might actually be reasonable for a government to consider that it would have a compelling interest, and all of that has been flouted by governments, by government agencies, by universities, by some large companies, by cities and against their police departments and other city employees and so on, all disregarding all of that legal theory for no apparent reason other than perhaps fear, that the fear that's been generated in the officials, in the people that they serve, and so on. I think that's been the problem here.
The CDC states that COVID-19 vaccines are safe, effective, and reduce the risks of COVID-19. Always consult with your personal physician before making any decision about your health.